Hey everyone, welcome to EverydayFI, the show that explores the lives of everyday people on the path to financial independence so you can use these stories to forge your own journey to financial freedom. I'm your host, Meghan Combs, and today's episode is part one with Ingrid, a retired software engineer who has embraced a lifelong passion for language learning and travel. In this episode, Ingrid shares her background of growing up in a bicultural family, her extensive language learning journey, and her transition to early retirement at the ripe young age of 43. She offers valuable insights into the consistent effort required to attain fluency in multiple languages, the importance of passion and motivation, and the role of financial independence in allowing her to pursue her true interests. Ingrid also discusses her blogs, the changes in the blogging landscape in general, and her balanced lifestyle between traveling and maintaining a home base in the United States. This was an inspiring conversation that highlights how financial independence can provide the freedom to pursue your passions and create a fulfilling life beyond the conventional career path. Tune in to hear Ingrid's full story right after a word from our sponsors. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Everyday Fi. Today on the show, I'm going to be talking with my pal, Ingrid, and I'm super excited to hear her story. Hey, Ingrid, how are you doing? Why don't you introduce yourself in your own words?
Hi, everybody. I was born in Ohio and then I mostly grew up in Texas. We did also have a year in Toronto and I did an exchange year in Switzerland when I was 16. But I've been living in the desert Southwest now for almost 20 years. My parents were German immigrants and I worked as a software engineer for 13 years. And then I retired at 43 in 2016. So I'm 52 now. I'm not married. I don't have any kids. And my focus in the last 9 years of FI has been mostly language learning, blogging, creative writing, photography, but primarily language learning. So in that time, I picked up a new language more or less every 2 years. And so I worked my way through Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, Italian, and now I've just started studying Latin.
Wow, that's really impressive. Are you fluent in all these languages?
It's always so tricky to define what's fluent, but yes, I did reach conversational fluency in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. And then my native language is actually German. So that's 6 languages in all. I did not reach conversational fluency in Russian, in part because it's so difficult, in part because my plans to visit Russia became derailed due to political reasons.
That's incredible. I am super jealous because I can barely speak English. And I took 6 years of French, but you know how American high schools are with languages. They're like, repeat after me. And then you just repeat a bunch of words for 30 minutes and take a test. There's no way you're going to learn a language like that, right? So what do you think set you up for being able to learn these languages? It's a skill that I think a lot of us wish we had, but we find it so daunting. And I don't want to make an assumption, but it seems like it's almost easy for you that you can pick up this many languages.
I think it helped growing up bilingual, of course, but I don't think I'm particularly talented at learning languages, and I don't have a great memory or anything like that. And I really think it just boils down to being really passionate and interested in it and being willing to invest the hours because in the end of the day, learning a language is just like hundreds or thousands of hours of exposure. That's all it is. And if you love it, then you're willing to undertake that marathon. So you just have to really find your motivation and then build some good habits around that.
Yeah, that's great advice. Are there any tools that you use to learn the languages, like programs or specific books or specific apps or anything like that?
Yeah, there are a ton of things. So once you have 1 or 2 languages on your belt, of course, it gets easier because you learn how you learn. And then you find out what your favorite tools are and you can apply them to the languages that come after. Although, to some degree, they're going to differ a little bit for each language. But I really like starting off with a good textbook because I'm a nerd. I like ASML or Teach Yourself, for example, for textbooks. And once I get to a decent level, I like to start taking classes online. There's a platform called italki that's really excellent for finding teachers for any language. A lot of the teachers are based in countries that have lower salary levels, and so you're using geo arbitrage. For example, if you're learning Spanish and your tutor or teacher is in Latin America, a lot of times it's very affordable for someone who's coming from the US or Canada.
Yeah, that's great. And so do you have to know like a basic level of conversational language to hire somebody on italki, or is it something where you can go in as a complete beginner and they help you?
You can definitely go in as a complete beginner. You can look for certified teachers that have a routine for teaching you, maybe a textbook that they want you to get. So if you find someone you really click with, you can definitely do that. You can also look for group classes, which would be more affordable. Personally, at this point, I'm more comfortable just starting with the textbook and kind of teaching myself the basics before I spend the money on lessons.
Yeah, it makes sense since you already, like you said, know how you learn. So you know where to start for yourself. So that's awesome. So, how long would you say it takes to learn a language, or is that going to be different for everybody? You said it's really just thousands of hours of exposure, but what would you say, like, how much exposure does somebody need to dedicate if they really wanted to learn and get to a conversational fluency level like you have?
Yeah, and that depends a lot on what languages you already speak.
Okay, so
So,
let's assume we know one language and it's English.
okay, then it depends on the language because a lot of European languages are going to be the easier to learn, say Spanish or French. Then you go to more medium difficulty languages like maybe German. And after that, you start getting into really difficult languages. So that could take multiple years of full time study to reach any kind of fluency like Russian or Arabic or Chinese. But I think Spanish, you should be able to get to conversational fluency in a year of dedicated study, putting in an hour or two a day. That's one of the most accessible languages for English speakers.
Yeah, and an hour or two a day does seem daunting, at least for those of us who have jobs or kids or side hustles. So, if somebody, say, wanted to do 30 minutes a day, would you just say, okay, 30 minutes a day, then that means that you'll learn the language in 2 to 3 years? Or do you really need to have that hour of dedicated time a day, or else you're not really going to pick it up?
No, I think half an hour a day would be a fantastic goal for somebody who's still working and has a lot of competing demands on your time. And what's really important is the consistency, not necessarily the amount of time. So it's really important to have daily exposure so that your brain continues developing and getting used to that language. And it's like a muscle that you should use as often as possible. It's much better to do half an hour a day than to do 4 or 5 hours just on the weekend.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I wish you would just give us all the advice to go live in the country. That's how you really learn the language, right? So just tell us all to do that, and then we all have an excuse to go move to our favorite countries.
Yeah, I think that's a common myth that immersion is the best way to learn because if you're not at the level that you can understand native speakers yet, immersion is not really going to help you. And the key is really finding comprehensible input. And that means that input that is at your level or ideally just slightly above so that you can learn a little bit so that you're challenged and that you're not bored. And some people call that the Goldilocks zone of learning when you're just in the right place. So, really, actually, I don't recommend going to the country until you have a decent level under your belt, until you have the basics under your belt, because you're going to also miss out on some opportunities to interact with the locals if you can't even say the basics. I always recommend having at least a lower beginner level before you go to the country and try to take lessons or try to live there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I went to Paris. I've gone to Paris 3 times in my life because I absolutely love Paris and I will continue to travel there. I don't care what anybody says about repeatedly going to the same place all the time. But I usually go for about a week. I've never gone longer than that. And in the beginning, my rusty French is just embarrassing. And I can kind of comprehend what people are saying, but I have to like really lean in. And I can tell that I look like a dummy because I'm sitting there translating it in my head before I'm responding. But it got better over the week, but not that much better. The comprehension stayed the same,
but my confidence in using the language and speaking the language got better the more that I interacted with people. And I feel like now I have a beginner level of French. Like I said, I took it for 6 years. And even though I took it in a school system that's not conducive to learning languages very much, I do know basic French. I know some of the grammar. I know how to pronounce things for sure. I can't quite roll my tongue, but I know how the French use, like, they drop a lot of letters, right? And people are like, why can't you just say all the letters? But I'm like, that's just how French are. And so it's even if I'm reading like a menu, I can pretty much know what that menu is saying, for example. But I noticed an increase and it made me want to stay longer because I'm like, man, now I'm leaving France. And now when I go back, I'm just going to be back at square one for my beginnerness because I wasn't able to stay. So, Ingrid, just tell me to go live in Paris.
Oh, well, I'll gladly tell you that because I absolutely love Paris too. And I did study French there. I did a month at the Alliance Française. So I got an Airbnb for 5 weeks, and 4 weeks of that was the course, which is typically language courses are 4 hours in the morning, and then you have the afternoon free. So I had a lot of time for sightseeing, and then I had a half a week at the beginning and the end as well. And yeah, I've been to Paris multiple times, and I absolutely never get tired of it. It's just there's so much to see and do.
Yeah, every single street in Paris is just beautiful. Just random streets that have nothing on it. There's no museum, there's no anything. It's just the buildings, the architecture is just incredible. I love it. It is packed full of people, and a lot of those people are tourists, but it's still wonderful. What brought you to Paris to learn the language?
My first time studying French was in the south of France. I thought it would be better to be in a smaller place, more relaxed. So I studied in a university town, Montpellier, and I did the same thing where I did 3 weeks and I was in Montpellier for 5 weeks. But I bookended it. I flew into Paris from the US and spent some time there before and after. And I had been there before, like, when I was a teenager and then in my early 20s, and I remember not liking it that much. I don't know why, what was wrong with me, but as I came back as a middle-aged adult, I was like, "Oh my god, this is incredible. I really love it here. I wanna spend more time here." So then I started looking into language schools there and planning a return, and then I did that later that same year in the fall, which is a really good time to be in Paris.
Oh yeah, I was in Paris in October last year and it was so beautiful. And I even was there late November one year, and it was like post fall, starting into the rainy season, but it was also really beautiful because it's the city of lights. And so when it's a little rainy and misty, all the lights get like a halo around them. Oh, it's so awesome. Anyway, you're making me want to go back to Paris. So, did you take that course as an adult after you had basically pulled the plug on your career and fired, early retired?
Yeah, and I always had a big interest in languages and in travel. And I was always really frustrated working because I felt like I could never have enough time off to do the things that I wanted to do. So early on, I think I mentioned when I was 16, I did an exchange year in Switzerland. And then I did my university studies in the US. But after I finished, I moved to London for 3 years and worked little jobs like in retail or in restaurants to save money. And then I would go traveling with the money I saved. So I spent 3 years basically backpacking the world and came back to the US and I found a professional job, but it just felt like being in day prison. So my goal was really like, how can I find an alternative? I really want to go back to this life of freedom. That has always been the thing that I've sought the most in my life is the freedom to pursue the things that I want to do. I thought of a lot of different things I could do. I thought, well, I could become a massage therapist. That would give me a lot of control over my schedule. I looked into teaching English overseas. I even did my TOEFL certificate and I nearly went to Brazil. But then in the end, I ended up deciding to go back and get a master's in computer science because I thought, "Oh, this way I can make good money and find a job where and the money will give me the control that I want." And so my goal was always to buy back my time in that way or to buy my freedom. And then at some point, not too long after that, in my late 20s, I discovered fires. This was in the late 90s or early 2000s when the movement was really just still very tiny, but There was still information online. There were a couple of forums, some blogs, and early retirement page. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do. Once I finish this degree, I'm going to have a good enough income that I could achieve this. So it became my goal. Once I finished the master's, that was my total focus. I'm going to find a job and get my income up there and then retire early as soon as possible. I'd set the goal for myself to retire at 45. But then the stock market did so well that I was able to do it 2 years early when I was 43 in 2016.
That's amazing. And of course, it's just since then been going well. So you're probably like, wow, I have more money than I even anticipated. That's what I've been hearing from a lot of people who fired in like the 2015, 2016 era. And they're like, now because this market has just run up almost every single year except for 2022, my portfolio is even bigger than it was, even with the 4% or 3% that I'm pulling out. And it's incredible.
Yeah, my net worth has doubled since I retired, which is incredible because I'm living off of that money. Actually, have had a little bit of income coming in post fire, which I didn't plan on, but just accidentally I ended up making money, which I think happens to a lot of people when they fire.
Yeah, because I think we're a community of people who can't just sit still. And even if you're traveling all the time, the two people that I have interviewed so far who are full-time nomadic travelers have side hustles because it helps them travel even more and it helps add to the experiences that they have, but the side hustles are in line with their values and their passions. So one works with a travel agency and she does group trips. I'm going on one to Egypt in October of 2025. And the other one, I believe she has a blog and she makes a little bit of money off of that. Not tons, but a little bit. And it just adds to her experiences. And it's just one of those things that it's easy to make a little bit of money if you're okay with it not paying for your entire life. If you don't need to pay for your entire life, there's a lot of things that you can do that are very enjoyable, I think.
Yeah,
Are you willing to share what your side hustle is after fire?
sure. I have a blog about language learning and travel. And I started it the month I retired, so January 2016. And at first, nobody read it except for maybe my mom. But then weirdly, I started writing about, I was like, oh, I'm just going to write about what I'm doing. So I started writing about learning Spanish and going to Mexico to language school and watching Spanish TV to learn Spanish. These posts actually started showing up in Google search and getting some traffic. So I thought, oh, that's cool. I think I'll do an SEO course. So actually a couple of courses on SEO and then learned how to do that. And then after that, it really blew up and it started turning into a full-time job. And I enjoyed it. It was rewarding. And I loved hearing from people that I had given the courage to go study Spanish or do whatever. And so that was the most rewarding part for me. And then it also earned money, which was nice. It was more than paying for all my travels every year, which was great. But yeah, so that was 9 years ago. Blogging has changed a lot since then. And it's become a lot tougher. And I'm just not willing to put in the hours to try to make it work. So the income has dropped off. I still make some money off of it, but due to changes in the Google algorithm, I just sheer amount of plagiarism in the field is very discouraging. So all that stuff has started to demotivate me a little bit, but I still keep up the blog. If I go to a language school, I'll write a review of it, especially if no one else has ever written about a topic and I feel like I can make a contribution, then I do it. But like you said, it is really nice knowing that I don't have to make an income off of this. Whereas Facebook blogging groups and those people are truly under the gun, very nervous because their income is dropping and they're having to go back to regular work. And fortunately, I don't have that kind of pressure. I can just do whatever I want and leave the rest. And then the other thing that I do is photography. So I publish my photographs actually under the Creative Commons license, which means that if you're a nonprofit, you can use them for free. But then if you're a commercial, then they have to pay for a license. So every now and then I'll sell a photo. I'm sure there's a ton of people that steal my photos because they're just out there. But again, it's like freeing to know, okay, people steal my photos. That's fine. It's not gonna affect me in the long term.
Yeah. And I hope nobody's stealing your photos unless they're really desperate for one of your amazing pictures, but it is amazing how that mindset is shifted when you reach financial independence. A lot of people want to become their own boss and they think it's going to make their lives easier. And your boss, when you're an entrepreneur, is your customers, your clients, and the income you're making. And if you're not already financially independent, then, like you said, you are anxious and under the gun, and you have less stability, I think, than having a W 2. And of course, W 2 jobs, you can always get laid off, of course, but there is a little bit more stability there, I think, than being an entrepreneur. And I'm saying this to say that entrepreneurs, I find, are so brave, the ones who do it full time. And I applaud them for doing that. It's incredible. I wanted to go back to your love of languages and your love of travel. You had a blog about it for 9 years. So, where did that love and passion originate from?
I think from maybe growing up in a bicultural, bilingual family and traveling a lot with my family. And so I just always was curious about other places and wanted to travel from a very early age. So the first exchange I did, actually, I spent a summer in Mexico when I was 15. And that was really incredible. That was my first time outside of Western Europe and North America, actually. And so that was just like a really phenomenal sort of learning experience. And I've just been hooked ever since. I do think travel is a bug that kind of gets in your system. And so once you have it, it's very hard to get rid of it. So I feel very fortunate now that I can indulge it, the free time and also the money to devote to it, which is wonderful because when I was working as a software engineer, I would sometimes devote my time off to travel and learning languages, but it never felt like enough. And then when I was working, I didn't really have the mind space to devote to languages, even if I had the hours. And in retrospect, like you said, I probably could have gotten up half an hour earlier in the morning and done some study then. But I had a really stressful job. And so at that time, it felt like the only thing I can do is passive exposure to languages. So I did listen to a lot of Spanish podcasts. Always when I did my walks, I listened to Spanish and I watched a lot of Spanish Netflix and things like that. But I didn't really study per se. I didn't really have the mental energy to do that until I left my job. But now I feel like it's become my job. I really look forward to getting up in the morning and studying. I'm a morning person. And so I devote my mornings to the more intellectually challenging things like studying languages, doing my trip planning, doing any kind of writing and editing and things like that.
Yeah, and you can hear the passion coming through your voice. It's incredible that you have that and you have that to look forward to when you wake up in the morning, because a lot of people talk about when they reach financial independence and they actually pull the plug to quit their job. Sometimes they're like, "Oh, I'm unmoored. I don't know what to do with my days." And even people who retire at a traditional age of 65 feel the same way. They're very unmoored and not sure what to do. And so I love that you found something that you're like, this is my job. I wake up and I study languages because I love it. Was that your motivation for reaching financial independence, was to like, I want to travel and I want to learn languages? Or was there more there to that?
I think like the ultimate value for me was freedom and lifelong learning after that. So like maybe my goals, if you express them in a more general way, would be those. I really just wanted to have my time back to devote as I wanted to, and also to have the freedom to learn. I did know it was definitely my motivation, and I had everything all planned out so that when I left my job, I had already started the blog like a month prior, and I had booked a trip to Mexico like 3 or 4 weeks later to go to a school. So after I left my job, I had 3 or 4 weeks to study Spanish and get my rusty Spanish up to par. And then I went to Mexico for 7 weeks. And I already had that year planned out a little bit. In the fall, I went to Spain and did the same thing. So it was important to me to know that I had a routine to step into and plans. I think it would have been really terrifying to retire and just out of void. I know some people might need that time to decompress, and that makes total sense. But actually, my last year at my job, I'd signed up for an experimental group to work for a large tech company. And I got a position where I was allowed to choose my projects and my schedule. So I told them I want to work 3 months on, 3 months off because I thought it would be a good dry run for fire. So when I left my job, I'd actually already been off work for 3 months. So I'd already had 6 months off the year prior to travel and get a feel for what it was like not to be at work. So I didn't need vacation and I didn't really need decompression time. So I was very happy to step into a busy life. I like being busy. I like having projects.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great way to do it. It's like what Alan Donegan says in his Rebel School, where he talks about doing little experiments and where it's like you don't want to jump into a lifestyle when you have no idea if that's really what you want. For instance, some people, they retire and they're like, I'm going to sell all my belongings and live on a boat or live in a van. And then they do it for a month and they're like, oh my gosh, I hate this. And it's too late by that point. You are not too late. You can always undo a decision, right? But it's a lot harder when you've gotten rid of everything and then you have to claw it all back. And so I like the idea of you did this like little mini experiment with your job, which how did you land a role where you could do that? Were you not being paid for those 3 months that you were off, or were you still getting paid?
Yeah, I cut back to 50%. So I became a half-time employee, but I still kept full benefits because they had a policy of giving full benefits to anybody who was half-time and above. And 50% of my salary was still more than enough to live off of. And I had already really reached FI the year prior to that. But then when I was offered this role, I really just couldn't turn it down. And when I left my job, I think people thought I was completely nuts. But not too long after, they ended up getting rid of that whole division and laying everybody off.
Wow, yeah, you dodged a bullet.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had that job too much longer anyway. I would have gotten some nice severance, but I could always have stayed in that job longer and made more money. But in the end, I'm glad that I left when I did because the money has been more than enough. If anything, I think I should have probably left sooner or gone part-time sooner.
Oh, that's interesting because you said you put a goal for yourself to retire at 45 and you already retired early at 43, but it sounds like you still had those feelings of kind of one more year or keep working.
I think like anyone, I was very nervous about leaving my job. And I can tell you back in 2016, the fire movement was not as mainstream as it is now. I didn't have any fire coaches to turn to or really any peer groups. I was in online forums. I had one role model that I followed, a guy who was about 8 years older than me, who had left his job and was doing language learning and travel. And I remember really thinking, gosh, that's what I want to do. That's it. And it was motivating to see someone doing what I wanted to be doing. But yeah, I was nervous. I wanted to make sure all my ducks were in a row. And so I made as few changes as possible when I fired. I didn't change anything really. I had already been off work for 3 months. So the only thing that happened was I drove to work and I turned in my laptop. Other than that, everything stayed the same. I got Cobra for the first year so I could keep everything the same, my providers. I had paid off my house the year before, so I stayed in my house. I live in a low cost of living area. And I just thought it'll reduce the stress and the anxiety if it'll be stepping off a ledge instead of jumping off the cliff. And I think that was the right decision because it did make it a really easy transition for me. And I've never looked back. I've never regretted it.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think we all aspire to that level of, well, level-headedness when we pull the plug. Just knowing my own personality, I feel like it's going to be me just throwing my hands up and saying F it and just being like, I'm out. I don't care how much money I have. I'm out of here. I'm tired of this crap. I love that you were able to approach it with a more level head than that. So that's great.
I think in some ways I stayed in that job too long. Looking back, I did what Carl Jensen of Mile High Fi called the death march to Fi, where you just put your head down. You're not very happy. The thing is, like, when there's so much money coming in and then your investments are growing leaps and bounds, it's very hard to leave, even if you're not happy. So, in some sense, you emotionally numb yourself and you just go through the motions. But I worked as a software engineer for 13 years and I enjoyed the programming. Like that part, it's fun. It's like solving a puzzle or something. But Unfortunately, that's not all you do in that job. There's a lot of other BS that you have to put up with. And that was what was really hard and soul-sucking for me. So I think I don't know what the solution would have been. It's always easy to have 2020 hindsight, but sometimes I think, oh, I should have corporate America wasn't for me. I should have left a long time before that and just gone independent, or I would have made less money and the benefits wouldn't have been as good, but I might have been happier being in control of my own destiny. But then, like you say, when you work for yourself, then everybody's your boss, right? So who knows how that would have really been.
Yeah, I think it's a grass is greener type of thing because some people are like, oh, I really don't like working in large corporations. I want to go to a startup. And then they go to a startup, and startups are, they don't have all that red tape and all that bureaucracy, but the goalposts shift so often that it's incredibly draining. I can say that right now. I'm working in a software startup. But then if I went to a large company, I feel like I would be bored every day because I would probably not have enough to do. So there's always that grass is greener. And yes, when you said that when you're a programmer, that's not the only thing you do, I'm like, oh, yeah, I know. And I'm not a programmer, but I work with programmers as a product manager. And believe me, I try to shield them as much as possible from that if I can.
It's a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of dysfunction in big companies too, believe me.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. So I want to rewind a little bit and I want to talk about your money origin story. So you mentioned that you have German immigrant parents. How was growing up with European immigrant parents in America? How was that different from maybe your peers that you saw who didn't have immigrant parents growing up? And specifically, European immigrant parents are probably going to be different than, say, Indian immigrant parents or Hispanic immigrant parents. What was that like growing up?
That is true. And I have to definitely always give my parents the credit because if I fired at an early age, it was entirely because of their inspiration and the values that they instilled in me. Because they came to the US to further their education and ended up staying. But the value was always, it wasn't about consumption, like in so many American households. My parents really thought that the American way of life was nuts. They both grew up in post-war Germany and a lot of poverty and sometimes not having enough to eat. And they were incredibly frugal and they were just really not interested in accumulating material possessions. It was really more about living an intellectual life, being in nature, learning about other cultures, travel in a budget kind of way, which is really exactly the way that I've formulated my life now is according to those values. When I was growing up, we always had cars that were 20 or 25 years old, and we ate like rice and vegetables and tofu, whereas my friends had Pop-Tarts and Doritos and things like that at their houses. And when I had those things, I was like, oh my gosh, wow, I've never had food like this before. And my parents thought that Americans were just total workaholics, which I agree with. So they managed to structure their lives in a way that they still had time for themselves and for family and for their interests. My dad worked in corporate America for a number of years, and he thought, I'm not going to do this until I'm 65 or whatever. It's just ridiculous. The amount of vacation they give you in Germany, you get 6 weeks a year. And people are not working overtime and weekends. People work hard and they play hard. When they're with their families, they're with their families. My dad ended up becoming a university professor, in part because that was a great job for him. He loved learning and he loved teaching, but also because then he had a lot of time off. He had summers off and we could always spend our summers together as a family. My mother was also a programmer and she had a part-time job that allowed her to take 6 weeks off unpaid in the summer. So she negotiated that with her employer. And every summer, we would either go camping for 6 weeks in the Western US and Canada, or we would go to Europe for 6 weeks and visit our relatives and travel around and visit other countries. And that sort of gave me the value that time is more important than money. I think being immigrants and there was still like pressure to get good grades and things like that. But I think you're right. Having European immigrant parents is a little bit different. They were extremely frugal and they were very focused on saving and investing. My father had discovered Jack Bogle early on, who founded Vanguard, and he was a big admirer of his. He said, when everybody else in that field was lining their pockets with people's money, Jack Bogle decided to give that money back to the shareholder with the index funds. So he was a big proponent of index funds from early on. When I was 16, I wanted to get a job, and my parents told me, we don't want you to work because the focus right now should be your schoolwork. The $3 an hour that you make right now working in fast food, this was in the 1980s, is not worth it. You should be investing that time studying. And I said, no, no, I want a job. And they said, okay, you can work. I think they said you can work 3 or 4 hours a week. So I said, okay. And my dad said, how about if I match in an IRA all the money that you make in your job? So I had my first IRA already at 16. So you role model that idea of investing early and saving for the future. So I continued that tradition.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I am so happy that you had parents like that because I was wondering, I was like, man, you retired so early. And when you retired, it was like, wow, that's such a short period of time. But now I know why, because you had an IRA at 16. That's nice. So, why did your parents move to America and are they still here?
They are still here, yes. My father originally came in his early 20s to get some work experience, and then he ended up getting his master's, and my mother came over just to visit her best friend who was married to my dad's brother who had immigrated with him, and then they ended up getting married, and the rest is history. But yeah, so they've been here for almost 60 years now. And my mom has become an American citizen, but my dad hasn't. So I'm fortunate in that I have both passports, which gives me a lot of flexibility. I've used a German passport quite a bit. I used it when I worked in London, and I use it every time I go to Europe because, as you know, there are restrictions on the amount of days an American can stay in the countries. But with the German passport, I don't have to worry about that. And if I wanted to move to Europe, I could do it. It's definitely something I would consider in future.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that something that you're planning on doing? And when are you going to do that? And where would you live? Would you live in Germany or would you live somewhere else?
I would definitely consider it, certainly depending on the direction that things go in this country. At this point, I feel like there's a lot up in the air. I do have the Affordable Care Act. So if my health insurance goes away, that could be a consideration for moving to Europe. But honestly, I really like having a home base here. I'm not too far away from my parents. They're in the next state over, and they're in their 80s now, so I don't want to be too far away from them. I also love having a house here in the US that kind of has my books and my things, and life in the US is very easy and convenient. It is very nice to come back here, but I also love spending time in Europe and other places as well. This year, I traveled for 6 months, which is the most that I've traveled since starting FI. I have to say, I think 6 months is maybe a bit too much. And I think next year I'm going to cut back because I like having that mix. I love traveling, but I love coming home too. So I would never want to be a full-time nomad. That just, I think, would get old for me because I do love coming home and having my space. But then I get home and I have that moment of, oh, so wonderful to be home and sleep in my bed. And then 24 hours later, I'm already on the computer planning my next trip.
Wow, 24 hours, not even, you don't even give yourself a week. That's funny. So, did you travel 6 months straight or was it just 6 months total throughout the year?
Oh no, it was 6 months total. It was
Gotcha.
two big trips to Europe and then a bunch of other trips also in the US, a family reunion and things like that. Yeah, I really don't like leaving the house empty for more than 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at the most. I do have someone who checks on the house while I'm gone, but things just pile up too much. I get home and there's just so much to take care of, bills or whatever, things that went wrong in the house and yard. And so I don't really like staying away longer than that. But yeah, in all, it's been 6 months, but it's been divided up.
Yeah. Have you ever considered downsizing so that the property you still have that home base in America, but it's an easier place to keep up. It doesn't have a yard. It's not a full house. If it's like a condo or a townhome or something like that, or do you like living in a house?
I feel it's definitely something I would consider, especially as I get older and maintaining the house and the yard might become too much for me. I built this house in 2007 and I lived in apartments before that. And I don't really like living in an apartment. I don't really like having shared walls. And something about owning a house is different psychologically, at least for me. I know it's not that way for everyone. I know that renting is actually probably a better decision financially. But just something about having a house and having a standalone house especially is just really gives me a really peaceful feeling when I'm here. I'm lucky in that the house is pretty low maintenance and living in the desert Southwest, the yard is xeriscape, meaning that there's no grass to cut or anything like that. It's about as low maintenance as a house can be. But yeah, long term, who knows? And if I moved to Europe, it wouldn't be to a house, it would be to an apartment for sure.
Yeah, especially if you're like in a city or something. You could get a pied à terre in Paris. Then I would come visit you.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. Yes.
That's it for Ingrid's part 1 episode. Tune in next week to hear the rest of her story. We talk a lot more about travel and languages, of course, but we also get to hear some of Ingrid's current struggles, wins, and a life hack that you won't want to miss. Thanks for listening to the EverydayFI podcast. If you're loving this show, here are some things you can do. Number 1, subscribe in your favorite podcast player and share the show with your friends and family. You can also find us on YouTube now. Some of the videos actually have our faces. Number 2, please leave a review. I am always looking for ways to improve the show. Number 3, check out my website, everyday-fi.com, where you can listen to all the episodes and leave comments for myself and the guest. Number 4, if you're interested in sharing your own financial independence story and connecting with other community members, you can find a submission form at everyday-fi.com/podcast. And lastly, number 5, join my Patreon membership for only $5 a month at patreon.com/everydayfi podcast. This is a one-woman show, so every little bit of support really helps. See you next time as we continue to go down the path to financial freedom.